So our second snippet for the recalibrated week looks at the other important aspect for the 1992 election, and that is the race for the Senate. And this is a year which is sometimes called the year of the woman. It's the first time in congressional elections, especially in Senate elections, where female candidates made a significant impact, and the beginnings of this more modern politics that we're still living in can kind of be traced to this. And the backdrop to this is the Thomas Hill hearings of 1991, where there was a not inaccurate sense that you had this Judiciary Committee of 14 white males questioning an African-American witness, Anita Hill, who said that she had been sexually harassed, and asking her questions in sensitive ways, in inflammatory ways, and in ways that suggested a lack of respect for her point of view. And even though in the end, more Americans believed Thomas than Hill, and Thomas was confirmed, there was this sense that that Hill had been mistreated, especially among Democratic activists, and it had a significant effect in Democratic primaries around the country. And there were two Senate elections, where the Thomas episode was decisive. The first was in Illinois. The Democratic incumbent was this man, Alan Dixon, rather bland character. A downstate Democratic official from Illinois, had been elected to an open seat in 1980, which was not easy to do if you were a Democrat. Remember, that was a Reagan sweep. Was easily reelected in 1986, was kind of this caricature of the glad-handing politician. He liked, everyone seemed to like Al. He was moderate, though, for a Democrat, tended to be pro-business, didn't have a great relationship with liberal activists, and he was the only Northern senator to vote for, Northern Democratic senator, to vote for Thomas's confirmation in 1991. And it wasn't a terrible surprise. I mean, Dixon, again, had this reputation as a fairly moderate Democrat. And when he cast his vote, it doesn't appear to have even crossed his mind that this would be politically problematic. He had never lost an election in his life. The Republicans basically weren't even going to run a candidate against him in 92, or a token candidate. I mean, he seemed to be all set. Shortly after his announcement, a mid-level Chicago office holder, her position was Register of Deeds, which was kind of the equivalent of a public advocate or something in New York City. I mean, not a particularly important position, named Carol Mosley Braun, announced that she was going to challenge Dixon because she was angry at his vote on the Thomas confirmation. Mosley Braun was was a product of the Chicago machine. She's an African-American woman, but she had a reputation for honesty and integrity. She was quite telegenic. She was initially, though, a terrible fundraiser, and it didn't seem as if she had any real chance to defeat Dixon. But when she jumped into the race, a third candidate named Al Hofeld, Alexa, stop. Alexa was giving us a reminder. Third candidate named Al Hofeld, who was a wealthy financier, a big Democratic donor in Illinois, was suddenly kind of looking at the situation and figured, well, maybe Dixon is going to be weakened by this Mosley Braun challenge. I can spend a huge amount of my own money. I'm going to jump into the race as well. And so in the winter, Illinois is the first congressional primary in the country. They voted traditionally in March. Throughout the winter, Hofeld spent millions of dollars in ads against Dixon. Dixon spent millions of dollars in ads against Hofeld, a very, very negative campaign. And oftentimes what happens in these kinds of campaigns, if you have a three-person campaign and candidate A spends all of his time attacking B, and candidate B spends all the time attacking candidate A, that both of these candidates become radioactive, and the third candidate sort of sneaks through. And that's sort of what happened with Mosley Braun, that because both Dixon and Hofeld assumed that she'd finish third, they didn't really attack her very much. And she ran on this straightforward message of she was kind of an honest Democrat. She would bring the party, into the 21st century. A vote for her would be historic. There never had been an African-American woman elected to the Senate. And for Democrats who were angry at Dixon's vote for Thomas, she provided a vessel to take this approach. And this is a clip, this is her closing argument in the last Senate debate before the primary. It's very straightforward, left-leaning, populist message.
You can continue because you're the first person here. Well, I'm in this race because I believe in the American dream, because I believe that this is the land of opportunity. The Senate has been a locked institution, a closed institution, serving only the interest of the very few for all too long. Women have been locked out. Minorities have been locked out. A voice for working people, for average people, has been locked out. I've devoted my life to trying to make my community better, to serve the public. I've devoted my energies. I have a reputation for integrity. I have a reputation for hard work. I've lived the American dream. I got scholarships to go to college. My mother worked also. It's a story that's familiar to a lot of people, and I'm concerned that the future for my son will be as bright as the future that my mother gave to me. And I want to see a better education system in this state. I want to see jobs created in this state. I want to see our dollars come home to serve the human needs, the human issues that concern us all. Homelessness, welfare, health care, those kinds of concerns are an opportunity for us if we just take the approach that we can make government work better, and we have the creativity and the energy to do so. Thank you, Mrs. Brown.
So you can see sort of what she offered, this moderate, inclusive message, and what she assumed correctly, as it turned out, is that activist types would vote for her anyway, but she could get a broader vote by appealing more to the center. And in what was an extraordinary upset, Moseley Braun won the election, despite being dramatically outspent by both of the candidates. She won by winning overwhelmingly in Chicago. She's in purple on this map. And by winning some of the key counties right around Chicago, and then you'll see she won 2 counties downstate. These are both university counties. This is a pattern that you might want to remember, because we'll see something not dissimilar to this when Barack Obama first runs for the Senate. And Dixon and Hofeld basically divided the rest of the state. Dixon won all of the counties in southern Illinois, but there aren't tons of Democrats in southern Illinois. And Hofeld, who's in brown on this map, won counties in central and western Illinois, but again, those aren't where the population center is. And Braun got the votes from liberals, she got the votes from African Americans, and she did very well with female voters. And there was a sense, she's really quite telegenic candidate, that upon her election, it's entirely possible you would have the first female president in Carol Moseley Braun. It didn't quite work out that way. Although she campaigned as a person of integrity, she was marred in ethical scandals later, even in the general election campaign, and then throughout her term in office. And she'd be defeated in her bid for re-election in 1988. But she's someone who would not have run but for the Thomas Hill hearings, and would not have won but for those hearings. The second race where the Thomas Hill hearings were decisive was in Pennsylvania. The chief Republican interrogator of Hill was Arlen Specter, very smart, not terribly personable, moderate Republican from Philadelphia. And Specter asked devastating questions of Hill in the testimony. He did a very good job cross-examining her, but it devastated his political standing. Specter's shtick had always been that he was this moderate Republican, and he came across as an ultra-conservative partisan. And in the aftermath of the hearings, an unknown Democrat named Lynn Yackel jumps into the Democratic primary. Yackel had never run for public office before, although her father had been a member of the House of Representatives from Virginia. She was married to a wealthy financier. She served on a number of volunteer corporate charity boards, but she was an inexperienced candidate, and she ran basically a one-issue campaign. She said, were you angry when you watched Arlen Specter question Anita Hill? If you were, vote for me. And that was enough to win her the Democratic primary over the state's lieutenant governor. It was a very impressive victory. Unlike Moseley Braun, however, who basically faced a token opponent in the fall election, Yackel was facing Arlen Specter, who had a long-standing reputation for fighting hard and fighting quite dirty in general election campaigns. And Yackel ran into a series of problems, which is not uncommon for first-time candidates in the general election. She had been late paying her taxes. Specter hammers her on that. She had been a member of a country club that had excluded African Americans as their members, which was not an uncommon situation in the 70s and 80s. Specter hammers her for that. And she often seems superficial on the issues, which Specter really hammered her on in this devastating ad run very late in the campaign.
October 10th, 1992.
Today, Lynn Yackel's campaign held a waffle breakfast so the candidate could make a case that Arlen Specter waffles on the issues. So the first question, cite an example of his waffling.
Oh, my gosh. I hadn't picked out one in particular. I think, let's see. Hang on a minute. Let me just think about that. Do you mind just for a second?
If you've been thinking about Lynn Yackel, maybe you ought to think again.
And so it created this image that she was sort of over her head, and in the end, Specter becomes the major Republican, contested Republican to survive in 1992. He wins by dominating in the Philadelphia suburbs. This is an area of the country that shifted very heavily to Democrats in the last 4 years. But Specter, he had enough of his background as a moderate a Republican, and the image that he presented was as someone who was competent, whereas the campaign had basically suggested that Yackel was not. But both Moseley Braun and Yackel would not have gotten the nomination but for Thomas and Hill. In Washington State, it was a little bit different. It's true that the ultimate victor in the race, a state senator named Patty Murray, got into the race in part because of the outburst of feminism in the aftermath of the Hill-Thomas hearings. But the scandal in Washington was far more serious. The incumbent Democrat, a liberal Democrat with a long record of public service, was named Brock Adams, who in the middle of his Senate term, a daughter of a fairly young daughter in 20s, of a longtime family friend, alleged that when she had slept over at his house at her father's suggestion, he had drugged her and had sexually molested her. He denies it. But the specter of this allegation, which seemed credible, hovers over his campaign. And then in early 1992, several more women, as you can see from this article in Seattle's largest newspaper, come forward claiming a pattern of harassment and assault by Adams, and he pulls out of the race the next day. Murray stays in. A former congressman named Don Bonker challenges her for the nomination. On paper, Bonker seems much more qualified. He had been a very effective member of Congress, one of the leading environmentalists of the late 70s and early 80s. But Murray's candidacy, the argument that she's running as the mom in tennis shoes, representing suburban women who are unrepresented in national politics, proves to be quite effective. In the primary, Washington has a weird system where it's an open primary, so all the candidates are are on the same ballot, and then the leading Republican and the leading Democrat advance to the fall campaign. It's pretty clear that the Democrat was going to win, so the race came down between Murray and Bonker. Murray is in blue on this map. And you can see she basically won the liberal areas of the state: Seattle, very liberal area, the Seattle suburbs, and over in eastern Washington, when she won in Spokane. The purple are Bonker's areas. He won the more exurban areas of Seattle. That wasn't enough, and Murray easily wins in the fall campaign. And then the last part of this year, the woman came in California, where it was an oddity because of a special election. The incumbent senator, a guy named Pete Wilson, had been elected governor, so he had vacated his seat. So his seat came open, and Dianne Feinstein, the former mayor of San Francisco, ran for the seat. In a competitive primary in the other seat, the winner was a suburban San Francisco congresswoman named Barbara Boxer, who attended Brooklyn College and graduated from Brooklyn College. Unlike the Moseley Braun and Yackel races, Boxer doesn't win solely because of the Thomas Hill hearings. She had a very impressive career in the House in the 1980s, especially on foreign policy and national security issues, and she basically runs as the most liberal a three-person race. But her gender helps her because she's running against two men, and there's this idea that 1992 is going to be this year of the woman, and she prevails in the primary. She wins the general election by a relatively narrow margin to become, at the time, probably the most liberal candidate ever elected to the U.S. Senate from California. Feinstein was a more moderate figure, and Feinstein, of course, is still in the Senate. Harris stood down in her last term. Excuse me, Boxer stood down in her last term. Kamala Harris took her place in the Senate. So all of a sudden, we move from a Senate that had only two female members, Barbara Mikulski, a liberal Democrat from Maryland, and Nancy Landon Kassebaum, a moderate Republican from Kansas, to a Senate at the end of the general election that will have 6 female senators, 5 of them Democrats, shown in this picture just after Election Day, Mosley Braun and Feinstein in front. Murray, Mikulski, and Boxer in the back. Among the effects of this new demographic in the Senate, the Senate leadership is forced to create a women's bathroom outside of the Senate chambers. When they only had 2 women, they said, well, we don't need a women's bathroom. And there is this sense of a body that exhibits a greater sensitivity, at the very least, to issues of gender equality. So I think Perot and the successive female Senate candidates are kind of the 2 big issues from the 1992 campaigns. So those are going to be our 2 snippets from this week, our recalibrated week. And you can watch them now. That's great. If you can do it next week, that's fine. And in the meantime, I hope that everyone is staying safe, and I will talk to you soon.